Good morning. I join you with our hopefully last pre-recorded shiur before we switch to live with our arrival this week, Bezrat Hashem. We find ourselves in Parsha Toldot, action-packed parasha, full of all sorts of different questions. And Ramban, whose commentary we're learning, greatly challenges some of the contemporary or conventional understandings of the stories in Parshat Toldot, be it the story of the birthright or the story of the brachot, which Yaakov takes from Esav. So without further ado, let us commence looking at this week's parasha. Already in the first opening line of the parasha, we find a fascinating point by Ramban. The Torah tells us as follows. I'm on the source sheet here in the very beginning. Ve'ele toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham. Avraham holid et Yitzchak. These are the generations of Yitzchak, son of Avraham. Then the Torah adds, Avraham begat Yitzchak. Avraham fathered Yitzchak. Vayhi Yitzchak ben arba'im shana, and Yitzchak was 40 years old. V'kachto et Rivka, when he married Rivka, but Betuel Harami, the daughter of Betuel the Aramean, miPadan Aram, from Padan Aram, Achot Lavan, the sister of Lavan Harami, the Aramean, lo leisha, as a wife. But the Torah does something very strange here. Now, we know we're in this great series of Toldot, generations. We have Toldot Noach, Ele Toldot Noach. We have the end of last week's parasha, Toldot Yishmael, the descendants of Yishmael. And now we have Toldot Yitzchak, the descendants of Yitzchak. And later on, we also have Toldot Yaakov. There's this strange phrase that Ramban picks up on here, which I just read, which is that after beginning to looks like we're commencing the generations and the goings-on of Yitzchak, we have this strange phrase here, Avraham holid et Yitzchak. Avraham fathered Yitzchak. And the commentators address this obscure language and why it's necessary here. So Ramban commences by citing the famous words of Rashi, which we'll now read inside. Avraham holid et Yitzchak, Avraham fathered Yitzchak. Lashon Rashi writes, says Ramban, Al Yedei shekatuv Yitzchak ben Avraham, by virtue of the fact that it said Yitzchak, son of Avraham, huzkak lomar Avraham holid Yitzchak. The Torah had to tell us that Avraham fathered Yitzchak. Why? Lefi shahayu leitzeinei hadar. Because says Rashi, there were various scoffers and scorners in that generation. Omrim, who would say, Me Avimelech nitabra Sarah, that Sarah became pregnant not from Avraham but from Avimelech, as we know, because Avimelech tried to take her away as a wife prior to the giving birth, prior to her becoming pregnant with Yitzchak. Lekach, therefore, because of these people who claimed that Yitzchak was not Avimelech, was not Abraham's son, but also rather Avimelech's son, therefore, Sar HaKadosh Baruch Hu klaster panav domeh la'Avraham. The Kadosh Baruch Hu forged the face, the appearance of Yitzchak, so that he greatly resembled Avraham. Shayomru hakol, so that everyone would say without a doubt, Avraham holid et Yitzchak, but absolutely Avraham is Yitzchak's father because he resembled him so much. So first, Ramban says, why is it there's this phrase? So first he cites Rashi, as we just saw, who says, Avraham fathered Yitzchak is coming to, the Torah is coming to tell us, without a doubt, everyone saw on by Yitzchak's very appearance that Avraham fathered Yitzchak. I think this isn't just a question of paternity here, but I think it's very indicative of Yitzchak's nature. The fact that Yitzchak very much resembles Avraham because he continues his path, not simply because Avraham was his father, and not just because the Midrash tells us that he looked like his father Avraham, but he very much is a continuation. We know that so much of what Yitzchak does is a continuation of Avraham. The fact that he goes to Be'er Sheva and digs the well that Avraham dug, for example. The fact that he goes to Gerar just as Avraham had gone to Gerar in the area of Avimelech. Very much so, Yitzchak is the continuation. So Avraham holid et Yitzchak, Rashi says it's talking about paternity, but more than that, it's what the paternity represents. That's how Ramban begins the explanation as to these superfluous words of Avraham holid et Yitzchak, that Avraham fathered Yitzchak. Ramban continues by citing the opinion of Ibn Ezra. For Rabbi Avraham, meaning Rabbeinu Avraham ibn Ezra Amar, he said, Od ta'am, another reason. And odd further, Shatam holid, why did the Torah have to tell us that Avraham holid fathered Yitzchak? It means Gidel v'Ruba. It means he raised and nurtured him. Avraham very much nurtured and raised Yitzchak. Kumo Yoldu al Birkei Yosef, just as we know from later in Sefer Parsha, it says that Yosef's grandchildren were born on his knees, meaning he raised them. Kumosha Amara, just as it says in the end of last week's Parsha, by Shalchem Me'al Yitzchak. In other words, Ibn Ezra's understanding, says Ramban, is this isn't just a matter of paternity, and not just what I said that is a natural continuation, but Ibn Ezra's point here is that Avraham raised and had an active hand in raising Yitzchak, in contrast to perhaps Yishmael and the children that Abraham fathered later on from Keturah, as we know at the end of last week's Parsha. The point is, according to Ibn Ezra, not a question of paternity, but a question of who had an educational hand here. And it was Avraham, Gidel V'Riba. He raised and nurtured Yitzchak to be a continuation. So those are the two explanations that Ramban commences. First brings Rashi, and then Ibn Ezra. But then Ramban gives his own important explanation here as to why the Torah has to tell us Avraham holedet Yitzchak, that Avraham fathered Yitzchak. And he says that here in the next paragraph. V'hanachon be'enai, and the real correct reason in my eyes, says Ramban. Why does the Torah have to tell us Avraham holedet Yitzchak? He chazar atav heichel ba'av hayachas. Because the Torah now reverts back to the av hayachas, to basically explaining the yichus, the relationship where everyone came from. Going back to the initial relationship, where does the yichus of Yitzchak come from? As is the practice of the Torah, that when when Torah is quoting Anshe Mala, people of great stature, it goes after the yichus, to go back to who they relate back to. Afkan, so too here, says Ramban, Avraham holedet Yitzchak. Avraham is the father of Yitzchak. Yitzchak holedet Yaakov, kasher yizken Yitzchak is the father of Yaakov, as the Torah goes on to mention. In other words, says Ramban, this isn't just about paternity, as Rashi said, and this isn't just about Avraham had an active hand in raising Yitzchak, like Ibn Ezra says, but rather it's because the Torah wants to give Avraham's yichus to Yitzchak. In other words, to say we are forming a chain here, we're forming a dynasty. Avraham to Yitzchak to Yaakov, and that is what the Torah is stressing here. But Ramban goes further. Ramban says as follows: the Torah comes back to telling this lineage, the great lineage of Yitzchak, that Avraham was Yitzchak's father. Why? But Amar, because the Torah had just ended off last week's Parsha by saying Ve'ele toldot Yishmael ben Avraham. So the Torah in last week's Parsha had spoken about Yitzchak's brother, Yishmael, the brother that wasn't chosen. She'im Amar Gam Ken Ve'ele toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham Bilvad. Had the Torah just said these are the toldot of Yitzchak ben Avraham, without giving a special statement, Avraham holedet Yitzchak, the Torah would be equating the Yishmael and Yitzchak, both in terms of their yichus, in terms of their lineage, and in terms of their mal, in terms of their level and stature. Because the Torah had just enumerated the toldot, the generations of Yishmael at the end of last week's Parsha, and now it's going to say toldot Yitzchak. Had it not given this special phrase, Avraham holedet Yitzchak, then it would have equated Yitzchak and Yishmael on the same level. And that cannot be, said Avraham. And furthermore, not only that, the Torah enumerates first the generations of Yishmael, who's the Bachar. And furthermore, Avraham, and this is an important point, the Torah never actually enumerates Abraham's descendants himself. And nowhere does it say Ele Toldot Avraham. Nowhere in the Torah does it say these are the generations of Avraham. And that's what it should have done. And the Torah did not wish to do so. So as not to count Yishmael and Keturah's children alongside Yitzchak. And therefore, Chazar v'hishlim, the pasuk continues and ends off by saying and stressing Avraham holedet Yitzchak. Avraham fathered Yitzchak. Lomar, that is to say, Kihu levado toldotav. Yitzchak alone is the true descendant of Avraham. And it should be seen as if Avraham did not father any other children. Yitzchak is, so to speak, the sole heir of Avraham. Commotion Emra, just as it says at the end and previously, that through Yitzchak and Yitzchak alone will your descendants be called. Says Ramban something fascinating here. If we go back to the pasuk inside, the Torah could not have just said Ve'ele toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham. These are the generations of Yitzchak, son of Abraham, because then he would have been on equal footing to Yishmael, whose descendants are counted at the end of the previous Parsha in the same manner. Rather, Yitzchak needs to be set apart, and therefore the Torah says, Avraham holidet Yitzchak, Avraham fathered Yitzchak. And the Torah does this to say that Yitzchak is Avraham's son, and in some sense, Yitzchak alone is Avraham's son. He is set apart from Ishmael. He is set apart from the children of Keturah, who Abraham took as a wife in later years. Yitzchak alone inherits Avraham. This is a very important point when it comes to the general trend of the book of Bereshit, when we look at brothers and brotherly rivals, as we're going to see, Yitzchak's own children, Esav and Yaakov, when it comes to who will inherit the father. So it's very important to bear the setting in mind that Ramban is quoting for us here. The fact that already Yitzchak is chosen as the one and only heir of Abraham is the beginning of our Parsha, which will tell us so much when it comes to who is going to be Yitzchak's successor in turn. This, if you like, lays the groundwork for what's going to happen in this week's Parsha, where Yitzchak has to pick, just as he was the sole heir, Yitzchak too, as Ramban understands it, will want to pick a sole heir. And whereas Rivka, through Nevuah, understands that sole heir should be Yaakov, Yitzchak thinks it's Esav. So already in the first pasuk of this week's Parsha, we see how Ramban is laying the foundations for why Yitzchak picks one heir. And in some sense, it's because Yitzchak himself is the sole heir of his father, Abraham. Avraham holidet Yitzchak. Abraham alone fathered Yitzchak and Yitzchak alone, and no other children. Yitzchak is the one true heir. And now the question is, who is Yitzchak's heir going to be? Ramban just finishes off there and adds, therefore, Lamala, so too earlier it says when it's counting and giving yichus to Yishmael, Gamken, it also says by Yishmael, Asher Yalda Hagar HaMitzrit Shifchat Sarah Abraham. It doesn't say Sheyalad Avraham, that Avraham fathered. It says that Hagar, the Egyptian maid servant of Sarah, gave who she bore to Avraham. It doesn't say who Avraham fathered, but who Hagar bore to Avraham. Lichvod Yitzchak, that was out of honor for Yitzchak. Lomar, as if to say, She'ein elu toldot hayachas la'Avraham, that we do not look at Yishmael as Avraham's lineage. Rakhem b'nei ha'amah, they are he is the maid servant's children. And Yitzchak's and Yishmael's descendants are the descendants of Hagar, who bore Yishmael to Avraham, but they're not Avraham's direct descendants. Ukomosh Amar, as we say, Gamet ben ha'amah lagoy simenu. I will also make the child of the Amah, the child of the maidservant, Yishmael, into a great nation. It doesn't call him your child. It calls him the child of the Amah, child of the maidservant. As if to say, your natural heir is Yitzchak and Yitzchak alone. This is very important, as I said, for trying to understand the context of this week's parasha. So we know that unfortunately they're married, but Rivka is barren. And that takes us on to the next section in our parasha regarding Rivka's strange pregnancy. The Torah tells us that Yitzchak prayed to God opposite his wife or regarding his wife, for she was barren. And God listened to his tefillah, and his wife Rivka conceived. But she has a strange pregnancy. And the children are wrestling, struggling inside her. And she said, if this is to be, Lama ze anochi. We'll go back to that phrase. That phrase soon. Lama ze anochi. Why am I here? Why am I? Lama, why ze this anochi am I? Why am I here? Vatelech lidrosh et Hashem. She goes out lidrosh, drasha, to seek out Hashem. We'll return to that phrase later as well. Vayomer Hashem la, God tells her, don't worry, there are two nations in your womb. And two nations, two peoples will separate from within you. and one nation shall be greater than the other, v'rav ya'avod sa'ir, and the older nation will serve the younger. This is what Rivka is told in her pregnancy. But let's return back to that initial reaction of Rivka. When we go back to Vayifrotzuha banim b'kirba, that the children, and she doesn't know it's twins, obviously, the children are moving around and fighting or wrestling inside of her. The Torah, and she says, Im ken, if this is to be, lama ze anochi, why am I? So there are different ways to understand this. So again, Ramban first cites two other opinions, that of Rashi and then Ibn Ezra, and then he gives his own explanation. So let's have a look. Ramban says as follows: Tomer Rivka says, Im ken, if this is to be, lama ze anochi, why am I? First says Rashi, Im ken, if this is to Godol Tsar ha'ibur, if this is the pain and the pangs of pregnancy, lama ze anochi, why am I? That means, says Rashi, lama ze anochi mitpalelet, why am I davening? Ava al ha'herayon. Rashi understands lama ze anochi, why am I to be? Why am I praying for such pregnancies if pregnancies are so uncomfortable? Leshon Rashi, that is those are the words of Rashi. That when Rivka says lama ze anochi, it means, why did I daven so hard for this if it's going to be so unbearable? Ramban doesn't like that. He says ve'einenu nachon, that's not the correct explanation as to lama ze anochi. It doesn't fit well with the language because, I mean, I can guess that it's missing words. It just says lama ze anochi, why am I? It doesn't say why am I davening for this. It says why am I? He doesn't like that explanation. So Ramban brings a second explanation, that of Ibn Ezra. Rabbi Avraham, meaning Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra, Amar, he says, he sha'ala et hanashim. She went and she asked other women, im ira lehem kachava, if that happened to them when they were pregnant. But Tomarna lo, and they said to her, no, we didn't have such difficulties in our pregnancy. But Tomer, and she said, im ken, if this is so, hadavar haminhag, if this is not the regular way of pregnancies, lama ze anochi, why is this happening to me? Why am I having a strange pregnancy? So the second explanation that Ramban cites is that of Ibn Ezra, who says, lama ze anochi means, why is this happening to me? That's what Rivka is answering. Why me? Why is my pregnancy different? Ramban's not such a fan of that explanation either. He says, according to this explanation, the psukim is chaser, the psukim are missing the explanation. It doesn't say, why am I different? It just says, why am I? So Ramban doesn't like that explanation either. Rather, he offers his own explanation. The hanachon be'einayin, the correct explanation in my eyes, says Ramban, is neither that of Rashi or Ibn Ezra, but a third explanation. Ki amra, she is saying, Rivka here is saying, due to the fighting inside her, imken, if this is so, yearly, if this is what's happening to me, lama ze anochi ba'olam. Why am I in the world? Why am I here? Why am I going through this? Halavai eneni, if only I weren't alive. She'amut, I should die. O shelo hayiti, or if it's better that I never was here in the first place. That's how Ramban understands it. Not why did I daven for this, which is how Rashi understands. Nor why am I having a different pregnancy, but rather simply, why am I suffering? That's how Ramban understands these words, lama ze anochi. Why am I suffering? In other words, Ramban just sees this as a woman who's scared for her pregnancy and that she's going through pain, and it's not clear to her what is going on and why she's experiencing what she's experiencing. Again, this reverts back to, as we've seen, the trend in Ramban's thought, just trying to understand from the position of the character, from the biblical character, and saying, what is she feeling right now? And says Ramban, what is Rivka feeling right now when she says these words, lama ze anochi, why am I? And Ramban says, it's the prayer of a desperate woman who's struggling with her pregnancy. Why am I experiencing such pains? So what does she do? The Pasuk tells us, Vatelech lidrosh et Hashem. She goes to be doresh, to seek out Hashem. What does lidrosh mean? So again, there's a discrepancy here between Rashi and Ramban. Ramban first cites Rashi. Vatelech lidrosh, she goes to be doresh God. Lashon Rashi says lahagid ma yehei b'sofa. Rashi understands lidrosh et Hashem, it means to seek out what the future holds for her. What is going to happen? Ma yehei b'sofa. What will her end be? What is going to happen? In other words, she goes to seek out what does the future hold for her? What is going to happen? Ramban gives a different explanation, in line with what we've just seen in his explanation of Lama Ze Anochi. Ramban says differently to Rashi. Ramban says, V'lo matzati drisha etzel Hashem, and nowhere in Tanakh have I found that it says drisha, to lidrosh God, rak lihit palel, other than when it means lihit palel, to pray, to daven. Lidrosh, when it comes to Hashem, says Ramban, means just to pray. It doesn't mean to seek out nevuah, to seek out the future. It just means simply to daven. When a person goes lidrosh et Hashem, to seek out God, it doesn't mean to seek out the future. It means to daven to Hashem, just to pray. Katam, and he cites other examples of where we see this in Tanakh, just like it says, Darashi et Hashem va'anani, I sought out God and he answered me. It means I daven to God and he answered me. Dershuni v'chiu, seek me out and live. It means daven to me. Chayani imei daresh lecha. In other words, what's happening? For Ramban, she says, Im ken lama ze anochi, why? Why am I here? Why am I alive? I'm in such pain. And she goes lidrosh et Hashem. It doesn't mean to see what's going to happen with her pregnancy, like Rashi understands, but simply it means she goes to daven to Hashem to help her. That is how Ramban reads these psukim here. We have Rivka who's struggling with pains in her pregnancy, and she simply davens to Hashem for help. And that is how Ramban reads Rivka's pregnancy. And thus she's answered. Vayomer Hashem la. Hashem says to her, Shnei goyim b'belech, don't worry. It's not that there's something wrong with the baby, God forbid, but rather the opposite. You've got two babies, and they represent two very different things. Two goyim, two nations in your womb. Two great nations are going to come with you. In other words, God hears her tefillah and says, don't fear. It's not pain, and there's nothing to worry about, but simply it's just two babies, each of whom has a very different destiny. Again, setting us forth for what comes when the children eventually are born. And that takes us on to the characters of Esav and Yaakov. And there's much to be said regarding Esav's character, specifically in Ramban's thought. As is the case, we learn and we grow up heavily influenced by Rashi and Midrash that Esav is a terrible villain and is evil, and the Midrashim are very heavy and insistent on emphasizing the evil nature of Esav's character. And that while Ramban agrees that Esav is not a good character, he dilutes, so to speak, or doesn't emphasize and say the evil nature of Esav. He's much more forgiving, if you like, of Esav's character as opposed to Yaakov. He's no tzaddik. He's certainly got problems, as we're going to see, even according to Ramban, but he's not as evil, perhaps, as stressed by Rashi, based on the Midrashim. So let's look inside. Psukim on top of page 2 here. Vayimlu Yemel Aledet, and her days, Rivka's day came to give birth. Behold, she had twins. Say Harishon Admoni, the first one comes out red. Kulo Ka'aderet Se'ar, like a thick hair. Vayikru Shmo Esav, they called him Esav. And afterwards, Yatsa Achiv, his brother, comes out after him. V'yado Achezet Akev Esav, and his hand is holding the heel of Esav. Vayikra Shmo Yaakov, and he calls his name Yaakov. Yitzchak ben Shishim Shana Boled, and Yitzchak was 60 when she gave birth to them. This shows you that they were married, because we just said that he was married age 40, so that they didn't have children for 20 years. And the young boys grow up. Esav ish Yodeh Sayid, and Esav is a man who knows how to Sayid, who knows how to catch prey, how to trap. Ish Sadeh, a man of the field. Yaakov, whereas Yaakov, Ish Tam, is a simple man. Yoshev Ohalim, a perfect man, dweller of tents. Vaye'ehav Yitzchak et Esav, and Yitzchak loved Esav, ki tzayid b'fiv, for he put traps or game or wild animals that he caught into his mouth. We're going to return to that phrase soon. Rivka ohevet et Yaakov, whereas Rivka loved Yaakov. So Rashi, again, as I said, heavily based on the Midrashim, understands the ki tzayid b'fiv. Why is it that Yitzchak loved Esav? Ki tzayid b'fiv, because he put an entrapment. He put a trap in his mouth. So, firstly, he cites Ketargumo. Rashi says, like the translation, like of Onkelos, b'fiv shel Yitzchak, because he would feed Yitzchak. Midrasho, but according to the Midrash, b'fiv shel Esav. It means Said b'fiv. There was a trap, not trapped game that he caught in the field to put in Yitzchak, but rather to give to Yitzchak's mouth, but rather shehayat sad oto umaramehu bidvarav. Said b'fiv means that in Esav's mouth there was a trap with which he would deceive his father Yitzchak. In other words, Rashi, quoting the Midrash, says, why did Yitzchak love Esav? He'd side with him because he was entrapped. He was deceived. The mirma, the deceit with which Esav presented himself before Yitzchak. In other words, Yitzchak's love for Esav was misplaced, according to Rashi, based on the Midrash. And that is Rashi's understanding, and the understanding we grew up on, that Yitzchak is misled, ironically, not by Yaakov, as we see from the Psukim, but by Esav. He'd side with Viv because he had a trap in his mouth and he knew how to deceive his father into liking him more. Ramban, though, does not take this approach as strongly. And Ramban says as follows: He'd side with Viv. Amrum Farshin, the commentators explain among the Ibn Ezra and Radak, he yiten side with Viv shal Yitzchak. Not like the Midrash that Rashi quoted, but simply because, why did Yitzchak love Esav? Because he would feed him his choicest food. Yitachen, and it could lefaresh, and you could explain, says Ramban, Vayehav Yitzchak at Esav. Why did Yitzchak love Esav? Ba'avur ki b'fiv shal Yitzchak had sayid tamim. Because in Yitzchak's mouth, he liked to eat game and various wild animals from the field. Kol hayom yitaveh le'echal et sayid. That's what he would like to eat. Tamid hu b'fiv, that was always in his mouth. Lo yachal davar acher. That was his favorite food, and he wouldn't eat anything else. V'hu, and Esav is the one, Hamevilo, who would always bring him food, Ka'asher Amar, just as it says, Ishu Dead Sayed, that Esav was a man who knew how to entrap. In other words, says Ramban, it's not like the Midrash that Rashi quoted, that Esav deceived him and into liking him, but simply Esav was the one who always ensured that Yitzchak ate well, and he always provided for him. Hu Hamevilo, he's the one who would bring him the food that he liked the most. In other words, Esav wasn't tricking or deceiving his father Yitzchak, going to Ramban. He was simply good at kibbud av. And therefore, Yitzchak's love for Esav was not misplaced, but rather simply was the love of a father for a son who was looking after his father. We see this difference between Rashi's black and white understanding of Yaakov as the tzaddik and Esav as the villain versus Ramban, who says it's a bit more colorful, not as black and white. We see this later on in the story as well. Not simply here, but later on when it comes to the story of the stealing of the brachot, stealing of Esav's blessings, or taking of Esav's blessings. If we look later on, it says, Vayavo el Aviv. Yaakov, pretending to be Esav, comes to his father, Yitzchak. Vayomer, he says, Avi, my father. Vayomer, and Yitzchak replies, Hineni, mi ata b'nei, here I am, who are you, my son? Vayomer Yaakov, and Yaakov, pretending to be Esav, says, Elav says, Anochi Esav b'chorecha, I'm Esav, your firstborn. Asiti ka'asher dibarta el, I did everything that you told me. Kum now, please get up. Shava, sit. V'ochla mitzedi, and eat from my side, eat from my everything that I've caught for you. Ba'avur tvarchani nafshech, so that your soul will bless me. Vayomer Yitzchak el b'no, and Yitzchak says to his son, Maze meharta limtso b'ni, how did you find food so quickly? Vayomer, and he said, Ki yikra Hashem elokecha lefanai. Hashem, your God, brought it before me. He gives a very firm answer. Baruch Hashem, he says, that I caught it. Hashem helped. Vayomer, and this sets alarm bells off for Yitzchak. Vayomer Yitzchak el Yaakov, he says, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like Esav. Geshana, come here. Va'amushcha b'ni, and let me feel you. Ha'atazeh b'ni Esav. Let me check if you really are Esav. And we all know that Rashi says what set off Yitzchak's suspicions here. It was the fact that he evoked Shem Hashem. That sounded too frum an answer. Baruch Hashem sounded too frum an answer to be Esav, says Rashi, and therefore he thought maybe it's not Esav, it's actually Yaakov. And Ramban starts by citing that, but again disagrees. Ramban says, citing Rashi, Lashon Rashi, Rashi says, Amar belibo, Yitzchak said in his heart, Ein derech Esav liot Shem Shemaim shagur b'fiv. That doesn't sound like Esav, because Esav doesn't quote Shem Hashem all the time. V'chein b'Reishit Rabbah, and that's also the Midrash in Reishit Rabbah, which brings the same comment. Va'ani tameh, and I'm astonished, says Ramban, how Rashi and the Midrash can say such a thing. Ki lo haya Esav rasha be'enei aviv. Esav was not wicked in his father's eyes. He was not wicked in his father's eyes. Again, Ramban is saying that this black and white, Esav the villain and Yaakov the tzaddik, is not so clear. Perhaps he was just wondering, says Ramban, because Esav is supposed to be man of the field, he doesn't mention God's name. Because he's always out in the field in unclean places, he doesn't usually tend to mention Hashem's name. But that would be deemed in his father's eyes as Yirat Shamayim, fear of heaven. But there's no villain quality to Esav that he would never mention Shem Hashem. Certainly not in Yitzchak's eyes, at least. So here's a nice expression again for this tension between Rashi and Ramban, whereas Rashi just paints Esav as a black and white villain. The story is not black and white for Ramban. And whereas we're going to see in a moment that for Ramban, obviously Esav is bad, he's not wholly evil in the sense that Rashi and the Midrashim portray him, at least in Ramban's eyes. So again, it's a nice expression here where Ramban says, Ani tameh, I'm astonished. It's not true just to paint it black and white as an absolute villain who couldn't mention Shem Hashem. Rather, Yitzchak would understand it differently. So what does Ramban think of Esav? So for that, we have to look at the first real point of contention between Yaakov and Esav, the story of the selling of the birthright, the Bechorah. So we know the Torah tells us, Vayazed Yaakov Nazid, Yaakov was making stew, Vayavo Esav Nesadeh, Esav came in from the field, Vayef is tired. Vayomer Esav al Yaakov, Esav says, Haliteni, now pour out to me, min ha'adam ha'adam, pour me out some of this red thing that you're making. Ki ayef anochi, because I'm very tired. Al ken karashmo Edom, that's why it's called Edom, meaning red. Vayomer Yaakov, Yaakov says, Michra chayot choratchali, first sell me your birthright. Vayomer Esav, Esav says, Hine anochi lech lamut, I'm going to die anyway. Lama zeli bechora, why do I need the birthright? We'll return to that very soon. I'm going to die. Why do I need the Bechorah? Why do I need the birthright? Vayomer Yaakov, Yaakov says, Hishavali kayom, swear to me today that you'll sell me the birthright. Vayishavalo, and he swears to him. Vayimkar bechorah li Yaakov, and he sold his birthright to Yaakov. And if there were any questions or doubts in our mind that Esav really only did it because he was forced to, the Torah clearly tells us that's not the case, because Yaakov natan le'Esav lechem muzid Hashem, he gives him bread and lentil stew. Vayochal, and Esav eats, vayesh and drinks. Vayakam, and he gets up. Vayelach, and he goes off. And even once he's eaten, vayivez Esav et bechorah, and Esav scoffs or scorns the birthright. So even after the fact, Esav doesn't care about the bechorah, about the birthright. What is it about Esav that he does not like about the birthright? So Rashi quotes that he says he has no interest in the rite of passage of the Bechorah because it was the Bechorim, the firstborns, were originally going to do the Avodah, the temple service. The Avodah and the Mikdash, the temple service. And Esav had no interest in that religious lifestyle, and therefore he didn't care. Ramban, again, seeing Esav not as the absolute villain, but nonetheless bad, has a different explanation for understanding why Esav was mevazeh, why he scoffs and scorns the idea of the birthright. Says Ramban as follows. He quotes a pasuk from Mishlei in Proverbs, which says, a person who scoffs something, it will come back to bite him. Aval kvar amar hatam, the Torah has already told us why Esav doesn't care about the birthright. Why he's so willing and forthcoming about selling it. Because he's going to die anyway when he traps animals, when he goes hunting. Says Ramban understands that phrase that I mentioned earlier. So why do I need the birthright? To mean, I have a dangerous job My hobby is I hunt. I'm a hunter. My life's on the line the whole time. It's highly likely that that my father will outlive me and I'm not going to inherit him anyway. So why do I need a Bechorah? Unlike Rashi, who says, I don't care about the future generations and about the Avoda, which is what Rashi said. Ramban said he understands, I don't care about the birthright because I'm going to die before my father anyway. The Karov, Shehu Yamut B'chai Aviv, he may die during his father's lifetime because he has a dangerous career, dangerous hobby. He likes to catch animals, wild prey. The birthright has no advantage for him. Rak acharei ha'av, only after a father has passed away. What use is the birthright to him? In other words, it's not out of some deep religious angst or lack of religiosity, but simply because it means nothing to him. So what is it about Esav that's so negative, according to Ramban? Why is he mevazeh? Why does he scoff and scorn and make fun of the birthright? Says Ramban, it's not because necessarily he's inherently evil, but because he's got a seriously misconception of the purpose of life. We're going to see this inside now. The Amare says, Vayochal, he eats, Vayesh, and he drinks, Vayakom, he gets up, Vayelach, and he goes off, Vayivez. All these verbs, look at the repetition of all the verbs here. Ramban picks up on this. After he eats and drinks, Chazar Sadel, he goes back to the field to his prey, to catch prey. That is the reason that he scoffs and makes fun of the birthright. Foolish people. Again, he doesn't call him a rasha, he calls him a ksil, a fool. There's no desire amongst foolish people. Rak, other than sheyachlu, that they'll eat, v'yishtu, and drink, v'yasu cheftzam be'itam, and do whatever they want. V'lo yachushu l'yom ha'machar, and they're not concerned about what tomorrow is going to bring. It's almost like quoting or paraphrasing here the Epicurean way of looking at life, right? They eat and they drink and be merry, and they don't worry about tomorrow, right? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. In other words, the issue with Esav was his outlook. He only lived for today in worldly possessions. He didn't care to plan ahead. Lo yachushu l'yom ha'machar. Foolish people don't plan for tomorrow, don't plan for the future. They only live for today. And that, says Ramban, was the issue with Esav. He only looked in the here and the now. He didn't care to plan ahead. Now, Ramban goes on to cite Ibn Ezra, who has a different understanding, but due to time constraints, I think we'll skip that for now. But you're welcome to look here on the sheet. Ibn Ezra gives a different explanation as to why Esav didn't want the firstborn and made fun of it and make fun of the birthright, and Ramban rejects that. But that perhaps for another time. Let's move on to the next major event between Esav and Yaakov, the brachot. The brachot that Yaakov, so to speak, stole from Esav by tricking his father Yitzchak. So we know that the story goes as follows. It was Hizaken Yitzchak, when Yitzchak grew old, Vatichena Einav, his eyes became dim, they were out from being able to see. Vayikrat Esav, no, he called Esav his son, Hagadol, his first son. And it's fascinating if you count here. It says Ben the whole way through this perek to tell us that the tension between the Ben Hagadol, the older son, the Ben Hakatan, and the younger son. It's fascinating if you notice how many times it says Ben here. Son. The tension of who is the chosen son and who is not. So Yitzchak calls Beno Hagadol, his older son. Vayomer Elav, he says, Beni, my son, Vayomer Elav, and he says, Hineni, here I am. Vayomer, he says, Hineni, as a kantin, hold, I've grown old, Lo yidati yomotir, don't know when I'm going to die. Va'ata, now, Sanach elecha, take out your weaponry, tell your arrow, bow, but say hasadeh, go out to the field with 2 lead side, catch me some prey. Va'aseli matamim, and make me a tasty dish, kasher hafti, just as I like, ba'viali, bring it to me, va'ochela, and I'll eat it, ba'avur tuvarchichan nafshi, so that my soul shall bless you, before I die. Yitzchak goes straight to Esav to give him the bracha before passing away. There are different understandings as to exactly what it is that Yitzchak is going to give to Esav. But in Ramban, if he's going to give him the blessing or a blessing or some of the blessing, Ramban is very clear that Yitzchak was going to give Esav the ultimate blessing. That which we spoke about at the beginning of the Parsha, that Yitzchak is Abraham's heir, sole heir. It's quite clear according to Ramban that Yitzchak wanted Esav to be his sole heir and to continue the dynasty of Abraham. Let's look inside. She saw that my soul shall bless you. It was Yitzchak's intention, says Ramban, levarechoto, to bless Esav, sheyizkehu bevirkat Avraham, that Esav should get the blessing of Avraham to inherit land. He doesn't beat around the bush. He says quite clearly that Yitzchak's intentions were that Esav should be the sole inheritor of the land of Israel, or the land of Canaan, and that he should be the Baal Brit, the one who has a covenant with Kadosh Baruch Hu, because he is the oldest one. In other words, there was no half-half here. There was no misunderstanding. Yitzchak had intended to give all the brachas, main brachas, to his older son Esav, and Yaakov comes and swoops in and takes them from him. The question is, and Ramban picks up on this, how can it be that Esav didn't know? That Yitzchak didn't know that Esav was not to be the right one. Because surely we know, as we read, Rivka had already been promised that Rav Ya'avod Sa'ir, that his older son will worship the younger son, and that the younger son is the one who is to be chosen. How can it be that Yitzchak did not know? And Ramban goes on to explain it. We're going to read it inside. It's a fascinating piece. Quite simply, there was a great breakdown in communication in our parasha between Rivka and Yitzchak and the entire family dynamic. The fact that they got to this point and Yitzchak had no idea that Rivka had already received a nevuah, a prophecy, that it was Yaakov that was to be chosen. Ramban says quite clearly here, it was in its full intention to bless the bracha of Abraham to Esav. He had no idea about the nevuah that Rivka had received, that it was supposed to be Yaakov. And Rivka never told him. And Ramban picks up on this inside, and it's fascinating to read inside, and we'll try and explain it outside afterwards, just how this could have happened. V'niren, it seems, says Ramban, shelo higida lo Rivka me'olam. Rivka never told Yitzchak hanavua about the prophecy asher amar Hashem, that Hashem had told her at the beginning of the parasha, v'rav ya'avod sa'ir, that the older child is supposed to worship the younger child. Ki eich haya Yitzchak over et pi Hashem v'lo titzlach. How could Yitzchak possibly have tried to forego the word of God? He wouldn't have succeeded. How could Yitzchak have tried to give here the bracha to Esav against God's will? Must be that Rivka never told him about the nevuah. V'hinei, and it seems mitchila from the very outset, lo higida lo derech musha tzniut. At first, Rivka didn't tell Yitzchak when she was pregnant about the nevuah at the very beginning, out of musha tzniut, out of modesty. Ki vatelech lidroshet Hashem, because when she went to seek out and daven to Hashem, shehalcha below reshut Yitzchak. She didn't go with Yitzchak's sanction or permission. She just went for herself. Oh, she'amra, alternatively, she said, I don't need to tell my prophecy that I heard to Yitzchak, who himself is a prophet. He's greater. He himself is a prophet. He must know this already. So from the outset, she, with good intentions, never told him, because she thought either in the beginning wasn't necessary to tell him, or she thought he already knew. Why didn't she tell him years later when she hears Yitzchak about to bless Esav? And now too, years later, lo ratzta lomaro, she didn't want to tell Yitzchak, kach hugadli me'et Hashem ter miladati, that I already heard a prophecy from God while I was still pregnant before I gave birth. Why didn't she do this? Because she said, ba'ahavato, out of Yitzchak, out of his love for Esav, lo yuvarech Yaakov, he's not going to bless Yaakov instead of Esav, yaniach hakol bidei shemayim, and leave everything bidei shemayim. V'hi yad'a, and she knew, ki p'sibat ze yitbarech Yaakov mipiv, belev shalem v'nefesh chafetz, and she knew for this reason that Yaakov will be blessed with a true heart. In other words, she knew of Yitzchak's love for Esav. Again, it's not like Rashi that he was tricked into loving Esav. He's a tzaddik when he really wasn't. But no, there was genuine love, according to Ramban, between Yitzchak and justified love between Yitzchak and Esau. And Rivka didn't tell, perhaps for good reasons earlier, she just didn't think it was relevant or she thought he knew. But years later, she also doesn't burst in. Says Ramban something fascinating. The reason that Yaakov goes and has to deceive Yitzchak to take the birthright, to take the blessings, is simply because Rivka doesn't have the courage, if you like, to tell Yitzchak, no, I heard a nevuah, and this son that you've been in love with all these years, he's not the chosen one. Yaakov is the chosen one. She doesn't have the heart to tell him. As a result, so much happens and so much shifts for generations to come. Because rather than just putting it on the table, which is the preferred option, however uncomfortable it might have been for Rivka, instead, Yaakov deceives his father. In turn, midah keneged midah, measure for measure, Yaakov himself will be deceived in next week's Parsha, and two siblings will be switched, namely Leah and Rachel will be switched, and Yaakov in turn will be deceived as punishment for the sin of his father. Later on, Yosef, Yaakov will be deceived by his own children in Yosef's disappearance, being told that he's been killed when he's not really been killed. And after that, Yehuda, who is one of the lead brothers in the sale of Yosef, will in turn be deceived too in the story of Tamar, who dresses as a zonah, as a harlot, and tricks him into being with her and becoming pregnant by him. In other words, this whole unraveling of deception throughout the rest of the book of Bereshit begins right here in this week's Parsha, simply because Rivka and Yaakov didn't basically speak out. There's an important message here in Ramban's words. Sometimes it's just better, however uncomfortable it is, to put it on the table. Because breakdown in communication is disastrous. It has disastrous consequences. And Ramban's message here is, however uncomfortable it is, it's still better to put it on the table rather than to break it, rather than to allow things to unravel and to go behind people's backs. Honesty is always the best policy. That's the message here. This also reflects back to what we spoke about last parasha, so we won't get into it too much, but namely the difference in the dynamic between the relationship between Abraham and Sarah and that of Yitzchak and Rivka. Whereas Abraham and Sarah have much more, if you like, natural, true love relationship. Yitzchak and Rivka, there was obviously an age gap, and Chazal talk about a big age gap, others less so, but there was clearly an age gap and there was a culture gap, and the relationship was more of a shidduch, it was more of an arranged marriage, and perhaps that's already sowed the seed, so to speak, this lack of closeness, as we saw last week's parasha. But either way, it comes to an absolute climax in this week's parasha, where Rivka never tells Yitzchak, I heard from Hashem that Yaakov's to be chosen. And instead, she and Yaakov deceive Yitzchak rather than putting it on the table, however uncomfortable it might be. But at the end of the day, Yitzchak's love for Esav was genuine. And we know this, and Ramban says it in this great phrase Ramban has, we're going to see inside in the next piece. But Terem Tavova Avaracheh, when Yitzchak finally realizes he's been deceived and that I accidentally blessed Yaakov instead of Esav, he says, Gam Baruch Yeh, he, Yaakov too, will be blessed. And Ramban is a bit disturbed by what this phrase is. And he says here in the second paragraph, I'm highlighting, V'anachon be'enai, and the reason that he says, Gam Baruch Yeh, Yaakov too will be blessed, even though he's been tricked by him. Hu lashon hoveh, it's a lashon in the present, yomar to mean, mi eifo hu hatzad sayid, whoever this person is that tricked me and took the brachas, asher haya yachol ha'ramatish baruch, whoever it was that deceived me into blessing him, meaning Yaakov, v'gam shieh baruch al kol panim, he'll anyway be blessed. Ki yadati ki baruch, I know he's blessed. Oh, tamo v'gam baruch yeh al korchi, whether I like it or not, al korchi, against my will, he will be blessed. She'i efshar li lahavir bracha mimen, I can't take the bracha once I've given it. Ramban understands some sort of metaphysical transaction took place in giving the bracha to Yaakov, and it's too late to go back with it. Ki me'az sheberech oto, once he blessed him, yada baruch hakodesh, he used through divine providence, was through divine spirit, shechala birkato alav, that the bracha was chal, the bracha took effect. This is why Yitzchak trembles. This is the great language I referred to earlier. Why did Yitzchak tremble? It's not out of shock of being deceived, but he trembles quite simply. Because he knows that his beloved son, Esav, has lost his bracha forever. That is why he trembles. Quite simply, he knows there's nothing he can do about it. This is the reason it says, your brother came in deception. After his initial shock, Natan da'ato he realized it must have been Yaakov. Because his bracha to future generations can only take effect on his own children. And therefore, if it took effect and through Ruach HaKodesh, he understands it's taken effect, it was Yaakov. But quite simply, says Ramban, Yitzchak's charada, his trembling, is quite simply out of the fact that he's crying with his son. If you like, whereas Rashi sees rage, and you have, when we learned in kindergarten, the rage that Esav had when he finds out that what's happened, and he cries out in fury. For Ramban, Yitzchak and Esav are crying together because Yitzchak wanted to bless Esav, and he's sad that his Bechor, his older son, cannot have this blessing. Little does he know that it was supposed to be that way anyway. And that refers to that breakdown in communication that we mentioned earlier. But quite simply, there's love here. There's love here between Yitzchak and Esav. It's not fury, how dare Yaakov take my blessing, but rather that Yitzchak and Esav are crying together because he wanted to bless his son whom he loves, and he hasn't because he's been deceived by his other son. Albeit for good intentions, he was still deceived, and it should have been put on the table outright. At the end, though, Yitzchak himself does concede that Yaakov receives the brachot. And that's the end of the Parsha. When Yitzchak and Rivka send off Yaakov to Haran to find a wife. It says as follows. And Yitzchak finally gives his consent. Vayikra Yitzchak el Yaakov. Yitzchak calls Yaakov, Yivarechot, and he blesses him. Vayitzaveh, when he commands him, he says, Lo tikach isha me'bnot Canaan. Do not take a wife from Canaan. Kum, arise, lech Padan Aram, go to Padan Aram to Haran, Beta Betuel, to the house of Betuel, Avi Emecha, your maternal grandfather. Kach lecha misham isha, take for yourself a wife from them. Mipnot Lavan, from the daughters of Lavan, Achi Emecha, your mother's brother. V'kel shakayid rechot charai, God should bless you. V'yafracha, make you fruitful. Yarbecha, multiply. V'yita likhal amim, and you shall be likhal amim, a congregation of peoples. And finally, knowingly, Yitzchak gives his consent that Yaakov is to be his heir. V'yiten lecha et birkat Avraham. God should give you the bracha of Avraham, lecha, to you, ulezarachan, to your offspring, itach, with you, l'rishtecha et eretz megorecha, that you should inherit the land of your sojourns, asher natan Elokim la'Avraham, which God gave to Avraham. In other words, if it was through deceit before, Yitzchak knowingly, with full intentions, concedes here to give the blessings to Yaakov, and he sends him off on his way. And it says, "Vayishlach Yitzchak et Yaakov," and Yitzchak sent off Yaakov. Vayelech Padan Aram. He goes to Padan Aram. El Lavan, to Lavan ben Betuel Harami, to Lavan, the son of Betuel the Aramean. Now listen to this: Achi Rivka, who is the brother of Rivka, Ein Yaakov ve'Esav, who is the mother of Yaakov and Esav. Why does the Torah have to tell us that he sent him off to Lavan, who is the brother of Rivka, who is the mother of Yaakov and Esav? So Rashi says, I don't know why the Torah is telling us this. Ramban gives a suggestion of his own. Achi Rivka, Lavan is the brother of Rivka, the mother of Yaakov and Esav, says Ramban, Ba'avur, since She'amar, the Torah tells us, Shetzivaya Yitzchak et Yaakov, that Yitzchak is commanding Yaakov, Lekachat lo isha, to find a wife, Mibnot Lavan Achiimo, from the daughters of Lavan, his mother's brother. Therefore, his Kir HaKatuv, the Torah decides to mention, Shehaya Gam Ken Achi Imo Shel Esav. Also, at the end of the day, she's still Esav's mother. V'ra'oi Hayan, it's fitting, it would have been fitting, Sheyitzaveh Gam Ken LeEsav, that really he should have commanded the same thing to Esav, go find a wife from your mother's brother's children. Aval, but Midato, out of his understanding, out of Yitzchak's understanding, Shebirkat Avraham tiel Yaakov ulazaro. From Yitzchak's eventual realization and comprehension that the bracha of Avraham is going to be only to Yaakov and his descendants, Asakeh. That's why he only commands Yaakov and not Esav. In other words, according to Ramban, the reason that it says Ein Yaakov ve'Esav, Rivka is the mother of Yaakov and Esav, is to say that yes, she's the mother of both. And Esav too should have taken, ideally, a wife from Lavan's daughters. But I'm only commanding Yaakov because Yitzchak finally understands that really Yaakov is the one who is supposed to inherit him. And therefore he has to take the wives from the family rather than from the Benot Canaan, who are not appropriate for the legacy and dynasty of Abraham. And this is that consent, if you like, or it's Yitzchak's knowing consent, as opposed to what he's deceived earlier, which was perhaps wrong. Here he knowingly recognizes that Yaakov is supposed to be his heir. I'll just end off with one other idea. Rashi writes here, Ein Yaakov ve'Esav writes that why does it call Rivka? Rashi writes here, I don't know why. Why does it have to say Yaakov ve'Esav? So my teacher of Aaron Lichtenstein said, in Kol HaKavod to Rashi, I think in addition to what we've just seen in Ramban, it's quite clear why the Torah tells us Ein Yaakov ve'Esav. Why does it call Rivka the mother of Yaakov and Esav here? Rivka is desperate to keep both her children alive and well. And she knows that Esau wants to kill Yaakov for taking the brachot from Yitzchak. She wants to keep the boys apart because she knows that's the best thing for them. She is very much in this moment the mother of Yaakov and Esau, the woman who loves deeply both of her children, albeit in different ways, and wants to make sure that, as the Torah tells us at the end of the previous parak, why should I be bereaved of both of them? I don't want them to fight to the death. I need to separate them. In other words, Yaakov ve'Esav. She is very well aware she's the mother of both Yaakov and Esav at this moment, and she has a responsibility to ensure that they stay apart. And that's why she sends Yaakov far away and keeps Esav home, because she knows she needs to keep both her boys safe. That's just another twist, if you like, understanding the Yaakov ve'Esav. She knows she's the mother of both, and that's the love for both of her children, that one shouldn't kill the other and fight, that she has to send Yaakov away. And we will end things there this week. And looking forward to, rather than having a pre-recorded session next week, looking forward to giving a shiur in live. And so looking forward to seeing you all in person very soon, and have a good day and rest of the week, and see you very soon. Take care.